Good evening, everybody. We will speak in English because it's easier for both of us. And my name is Martin Šimečka. I have the guest whom you already know, who's already been introduced, Volodymyr Yermolenko. And I'm happy to talk to you because I have seen you in various interviews in New York Times, by the way, and the others. And I have heard that you had a terrible long journey from Ukraine, that you spent hours and hours on the border in Poland. Why was it?
First, thank you so much for invitation, and it's a big pleasure to be here. This is my first time in Bratislava. Well, I have no idea why it was long, but we stayed for 10 hours on the border. We were told that before us there was a bus with some people that had troubles with papers, and therefore we were staying a bit longer than expected.
Well, 10 hours in the bus, just on the border, staying there. Well.
Yeah, just to remind that there is no air connection with Ukraine, and we cannot fly. We cannot fly from any city, even Lviv in the western Ukraine. And the country, so for you to understand, there is only one region, which is, I think, Bukovina, Chernivtsi, which did not suffer from missile strikes since 24th of February. 600,000 square kilometers, that's Ukrainian territory. Only one tiny region was not covered by missile strikes. Even the western region, like Lviv, like Ivano-Frankivsk, they will still suffer from missile strikes. Russia is now acting as a big missile and nuclear terrorist. Therefore, we don't have air connection. Therefore, all trip, and this is, by the way, my first trip abroad from 24th February, because I prefer to stay in my country during these hard times. But yeah, this takes a long time to cross the border and to go from Kyiv, which is in the central Ukraine, to cross the border 2,000 kilometers, and then the border crossing is complicated.
Well, we will talk about identity, Ukraine, of course, and various topics. But first of all, I would like to ask you. I mean, last 2 weeks we are in a big. It's a big excitement for me, at least, about the counteroffensive of Ukrainian forces. I have to admit that I have a big hope for that, and there are analysts who say this is a turning point. Some say we should be careful about that. But my question is, I know you are not a military analyst, but still, the question is whether it is a turning point in your eyes. And how Ukrainians think about that. How do they feel about that? Did that encourage them? Did that improve the spirit?
Of course, but let us not forget that this is a second major victory, strategic victory of Ukraine since 24th of February. If you look at the map, you will see that now Ukrainians liberated approximately half of the territory which was occupied by Russians by late March. So the first big Russian defeat was that they were forced to leave Kyiv surroundings, Chernihiv, Sumy, northern Ukraine. Now the second is that they basically fled from the Kharkiv region. And that means that there is some, I think, strategic advantage of Ukrainian army, despite the fact that we are still have far less ammunition, have far less artillery, far less tanks, aviation, etc. So in terms of materials, we are, of course, weaker than the Russian army. But in terms of motivation, in terms of people on the ground, in terms of smartness and skillfulness, Well, it seems that Ukrainian army is very smart, because one of the explanations of what happened is that Ukrainian army showed to the Russians that they will be counteroffensive in the south, on Kherson, which is the biggest city taken by the Russians. Russians regrouped their forces to put more people, put more army units in Kherson in the south, and Ukrainians attacked in the east. Before that, Ukrainians were just destroying Russian logistic supplies, the same as Ukrainians did in March. So basically, you have a huge army which is constantly cut from fuel supplies, ammunition supplies, food supplies, medicine supplies, etc., etc. So this is kind of, analysts are saying that Ukrainians are trying to wage the war of the 21st century, while the Russians are waging the war of the 20th century.
There are, now it's already kind of a slogan which is almost banal, that after 24 February there were a lot of analyses and commentaries that actually this Ukrainian unity against Russians now just created the Ukrainian nation as a political nation. Because before that it was just divided somehow between the Russian kind of part of that country and the Ukrainian Western. Is that true in your eyes, that now it's definite Ukrainian nation is created as one united nation?
I think it is partially true, partially not. Because if we address Ukrainian intellectuals of the 19th century, one of my favorites is Mikhailo Drahomanov, one of the key intellectual figures of the Ukrainian 19th century. Ukraine did not have statehood. It was part of two empires, the Habsburg and the Russian Empire. But when Ukrainian ethnographers were describing the kind of the territory that they would dream about as to be Ukraine, where people spoke, primarily peasants, spoke Ukrainian language, where there were Ukrainian traditions, etc. This description coincided more or less with the current borders of Ukraine. One of the fantastic events in that period, that was 1860s, 1870s, is then when intellectuals from, like Drahomanov or some other intellectuals from Russian Empire, Ukraine, moved, because of the repressions of the Russian Empire, moved to Habsburg Empire, to Galicia, and suddenly realized that in Galicia there are people who speak the same language, and also read Taras Shevchenko as passionately as people living in the Russian Empire. Then we need to understand what happened next. Next, Ukrainian language was banned in the Russian Empire for half a century. There was a short revival, cultural revival in the 1910s, then 1920s, even under Soviet Union. Then it was brutally eradicated. All, like hundreds of Ukrainian writers, playwrights, painters were executed, and at least 4 million of Ukrainian peasants. And by that time it was, I think, 20% of the population was killed in the Holodomor. Of course, there were deportations, there are some other things. So the demography of the Ukrainian territory was radically changed. And this is something that Russians are doing systematically. This is what they have done with Crimea. Crimea in early 20th century was 90% Crimean Tatar. Now, after several deportations, after the deportation in 1944, etc., and right now after the annexation of Crimea, Russians are changing the demographic composition of Crimea. So of course they can say, well, look, there are no Ukrainians on this territory because they killed so many people and they deported others. But despite this fact, I think Ukrainian was pretty much divided in around 2010, but gradually, it was very gradual process when even people who were cultivated in Russian-speaking culture, in Russian-speaking families, are gradually moving towards the Ukrainian identity. Not so much ethnic identity, but political identity. And we see every crisis, actually, the first invasion of 2014 led also to this expansion of the Ukrainian political identity. Now, just talk to people in Kharkiv, which is predominantly Russian-speaking city, 40 kilometers from the Russian border, which is every day shelled by the Russian missiles. Speak to people in Mykolaiv, to the southern Ukraine, also predominantly Russian-speaking city, which is shelled every day by missiles. Do they want to be part of the Russian world? I think the obvious answer is no. And in a way, Russians, of course, they are alienating Ukrainians even more. So now the question is not language. Many Ukrainian patriots, many people on the front line speak Russian, and all of us, many of us, I mean myself, my journey is also very gradual because I was rather in the Russian-speaking family, going to Russian-speaking school. But gradually now I speak only Ukrainian with my family and in public life. So these are rather gradual changes. But even for Russian speakers, I mean, when you come to Kharkiv or to Dnipro or to Odessa, the language doesn't really play a role here. We have the Ukrainian nation who are primarily define themselves as people who want anti-tyrannical or non-tyrannical state, a state that will be built upon republican and democratic values rather than imperial values.
Well, my question is about that because while you are now in the country, you have never been before, but this is a small country, we all speak more or less one language, but we are deeply divided, so you sometimes haven't the feeling this is one nation in sense of political nation. And I have just now read an essay from Timothy Snyder, who quotes the German historian Frank Golczewski, who says that the nation is not created by language or ethnicity or religion, but by realization of certain historical and political chance. And exactly that is a Ukrainian case, isn't it? That's because Ukrainians now have chosen and they are realizing a historical and political chance they have chosen for themselves.
Yes, we can say that. I think we should also not overestimate the ethnic concept of the nation. I think there is a balance between the two because imagine Ukraine, which will be democratic but Russian-speaking, totally Russian-speaking. I think it will not sustain its identity for a very long time because there is this drive at the same time for cultural identity, which is different from the imperial identity, but also political identity. And the thing is that for many Ukrainians, and in here is something that we see in public opinion polls, even before this full-scale invasion, you ask a person from the eastern southern region, okay, what is your language of family language? They say, of course, Russian. Next question, what is the language of school education you want for your children? And they say Ukrainian. Next question, imagine you're watching a movie about Ukrainian independence. Last year we celebrated 30 years of Ukrainian independence. What language would you prefer it to be? And they say Ukrainian. So this is interesting combination when you can say that the private language can be Russian or Crimean Tatar or Hungarian or Slovak or Polish. But the public language, the community language is Ukrainian. Crimean Tatar community is probably the most vocal because Crimean Tatars, whom I know, whom are my friends, are actually trilingual. right? So they speak Kirimli, they speak Crimean Tatar, Ukrainian and Russian, and of course some other languages, but they're the number of languages. So I think we are coming back to a linguistic situation which was in pre-modern Europe, right? So when, for example, there's Latin, which is playing a certain status, then there are vernacular language. The problem is, the interesting paradox is that Russian language was pretending to be a Latin language for like Soviet Union, like Latin, right, lingua franca. And then you can speak your vernacular language as you want. Now Russian in some regions turns into vernacular language of everyday use. But the language of institutions, media, culture, education is Ukrainian. And it's an interesting paradox. I think it's interesting. I mean, it shows us that a nation can be bilingual, trilingual.
Yes, but that means what you are saying means that the common language finally in the future probably will be Ukrainian, but as a result of some political and historical realization of a choice. So that's unlike in Slovakia, for example, the language was just that was a clue to the identity, but it can be otherwise. So language can be as a result of that decision. That's interesting. I mean, I like to hear that because I don't feel that the language itself, it should be.
Yeah. So Ukrainian in many aspects, Ukrainian reality is not very much comparable to others. In some aspects, it is comparable to others. In some aspects, it is not. So you cannot understand Ukrainian language reality if you look in the Baltic states, if you look at Latvia, for example, or if you look at Belgium, or if you look at Switzerland. They are totally different things because a typical situation for Ukraine is that you start a phrase in Ukrainian and finish it in Russian, or you mix both.
Talking about the war, I mean, my personal reflection of that, not but of course I have read many authors about that, and exactly Timothy Snyder repeats it all the time. That is war actually the last colonial war, where Russia is an imperial, which tries to, I mean, conquer what it thinks its colonial territory. Do you see it in this way as well?
Of course. We've met Timothy a few days ago in Kiev, and I can announce that we've made a very interesting podcast, and I lead the website which is called Ukraine World, which is a website in English about Ukraine. We also have a podcast explaining Ukraine, but now I'm launching a new series which I called Thinking in the Dark Times, meaning that the stray of light and wisdom, as Hegel said, comes out during the dark times. So this is also a chance for thinking, for rethinking. And some of my friends abroad are asking, so how can you think, how can you make literature festivals, for example? Next week we are going to Kharkiv. Zhadan is doing a big festival there, and the city is shelled, as I say, constantly. And this is also a method to say fuck to Putin. Sorry to put it this way, to say that we are not afraid. And people who are staying in Kharkiv are just remarkable. People who are doing culture there, etc. And in many other cities. So, answering your question, one of the ways we can read the history of the 20th century of Europe is de-imperialization, right? I think it's also Tim Snyder who said that, look, the traditional history of the European Union, like all the nation states who just unified their efforts, is wrong, because the real history is that most of the countries that formed the initial European communities were former empires or actual empires. I think that for me, by the way, it's very good sometimes to think about something being outside. So for a Ukrainian to think about European Union, I think it's kind of also brings some value added, because I'm thinking about European Union not through what we read in the textbooks, like this economic integration, coal and steel community. I think it's just very, very blind vision of that. I think we should come back to a very important text of the 20s, written by an Austrian, Coudenhove-Kalergi, Pan Europa, in which he clearly said why Europe needs something like United States of Europe to protect the smaller states, smaller nation states, primarily those states who were created after the fall of the Habsburg Empire, to protect them against two big empires, which he saw very clearly. And it was in early 20s. He saw the emergence of the new German Empire, early 20s. Germany is a Weimar Republic. Nothing shows that it will be a Third Reich, right? And Russian Empire, again, Soviet Union, Lenin's idea of a national emancipation, etc. So he was very, very clear about that. He understood that Europe should be united to protect the idea of freedom and democracy against imperialism. And all the economic integration just comes afterwards. And what happened next? The German Empire, the Germanic imperial idea, which was very toxic in the first half of the century, and basically both the First World War and the Second World War, were actually also the clash between these two imperial ideas, Germanic one and the Russian one. And then Germanic imperial idea collapsed in 1945. And then the whole Europe, and then there was de-imperialization, and the whole Europe believed that the imperialism is over, forgetting that there is a Russian Empire in the form of the Soviet Union, which considers all this de-imperialization as a bad thing, which considers that the world should be governed by empires, but big powers, that should be clear poles, most probably bipolar world or tripolar world, and that means, of course, spheres of interest and imperial enlargement. So this is one thing. Of course, Russia is not a nation state, it is an empire. And it is a wounded empire that lost what it considers as its past glory. And as any wounded empire like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Germany, it wants to come back to this, mythical, glorious past. But there is one important difference of Russian Empire with maritime empires that, we also learned from textbooks about 19th century and 20th century. Britain, France, Belgium, whatever. Maritime empires were colonizing very different societies. And they were thinking that these societies are different, so we should think this difference to justify power, justify our domination on them. How we can think this difference through hierarchy. Therefore, they developed the racist theories, which then led to Nazi theories, right? Let's not forget that Nazism, racism was based upon British and French racism of the 19th century. Russian Empire is different. Russian Empire says it colonizes people who are close to it. And with Ukrainians and Belarusians, it colonizes nations which are from the one linguistic group. And they are saying that their instrument of domination is not the concept of difference, but the concept of sameness. Yeah. They are saying, you are not different from us, you are the same as us. Your identity is not existing. And this is also a type of imperialism, but it is a little bit different. So the maritime imperialism says that sameness is illusion. You, the colonized, will be always inferior to us, different to us. Russian imperialism says that difference is illusory, and only sameness is real. And if you look at the Russian classical philosophy, like Vladimir Solovyov and his idea of pan-unity, всеединство, you see how Russian thinking was undermining the differences. Not only with regard to Ukrainians, Belarusians, but with regard to other people.
Of course, we know something about that because we were part of that empire in the past. But you can also look at that European Union could be recognized also as an empire, but just a peaceful one. And the difference that the other countries would be happy to be part of that empire, which is very different than from the past. So, is it are Ukrainians really looking forward to be part of that European empire, European Union, let's say?
I think the only empire with which we can compare European Union is the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation of the medieval times, and or the Carolingian Empire, or even maybe go even farther than that and say that current European Union really resembles the medieval Europe with different poles of influence. I'm sometimes joking that, look, the president of the European Commission is a pope, and president of the European Council is an emperor, president of the European Parliament is somebody else. So, and this plurality of centers, I think it is something that makes European Union much more resemble a republican model. In republican model, what basically was present in the 19th century thinkers all across Europe, this metaphor, which I like very much, Republic of Peoples. And of course we understand that this idea of Republic of Peoples is not ideal, etc. But this idea is seeking a kind of a balance between the idea of the nation state and the idea of the empire. It seeks a third way. And I don't know whether we can invent something better than that. Coming back to your question about Ukraine, Ukrainians do want to join the European Union, of course. We received now the candidate status, but I think the Europe that we should be building should be different. In which sense? European Union is a society that has been built upon the idea that peace is eternal. And this is something that is good as an idea, but I think it's deeply illusionary. Ukrainians cannot afford this idea. So we should assume that, for example, well, we all believe in the victory against Russia now, but we have no illusion that, I have no illusion that Russia will miraculously collapse. Maybe will happen as with Soviet Union, but I think this should be one of the plausible scenarios. The more realistic scenario is that it will continue to exist and it will try to have the revenge and to renew the war. And Ukraine, both Ukraine and Europe should be prepared. And for Ukraine, that means that very big amount of state budget will go to security, to defense, to the army, to the security sector. Therefore, we cannot build a welfare state. If we cannot build a welfare state, so we cannot make the state so, caring about the citizens as, for example, in Germany, that means we should give Ukrainians a very clear message that, look, the state is very present in security and is minimal in the economics or some other fields. So in a certain way, it is a combination of the security state and a libertarian state. The question for me is whether it will be possible within the European Union.
Well, with the help of NATO, maybe. I have heard from you, but also from the others. I have read a very nice article from Anne Applebaum from Odessa about Ukraine society. Something has changed there, which is for me very interesting as an experience, that the relationship between state and society has dramatically changed in the war. Especially between the activists, the NGOs, not only those who fight, but inside that society, that it came to a kind of a not only peace, but understanding that you need each other. Is that true?
Yes, I think so. It's not ideal because during more or less normal times, Ukrainian society is a society of mistrust to the state. And this can be explained by the fact that Ukrainian statehood tradition is very weak. And Ukrainians have in mind that the state is always an instrument of violence and an instrument of occupation. So the state always comes from the outside. Therefore, we should cheat the state. And that's a big problem. So the level of mistrust to the state institutions are very often compensated by a very big trust on the horizontal level. I always joke that in Ukraine, you can buy a car sometimes with a certain document which actually says that the owner of the car still owns the car, but you already has given money to him. And this is a mutual trust, very strange thing, because if the owner of the car says, no, I don't know this guy, this is my car, you have nothing again, you get nothing to do. And if you break this car or make an accident and says, no, it's not me, it's the owner of the car, the owner is not able to do something. So this is a very interesting horizontal relation of trust. And I think this is something which is now playing out in this volunteer movement. So what is the volunteer movement right now? Right now, from Bratislava, we'll go to Lviv to pick up the car that I will drive to Kharkiv to our defenders. I given this money to the car to the person I've seen for the first time and maybe last time in my life, but I have full trust to him. And this is like that, right? So it's a remarkable also level of trust. This is therefore I think that Ukrainian society also gives us some idea of what trust is. You cannot really have the totally mistrustful society. Trust is something that is present in society, and the question is where you direct it. If you direct it to your people, to your neighbors, then you lack it towards the state, or vice versa, right? So I think that the big challenge right now is how to direct this trust not only towards the neighbors, but towards the state institutions. And I think this is something going on. Zelensky is trying to do that. Basically, when he won the election, he won in 2019, he won the election on very populist slogans. And he was maybe similar in some aspects with other populists around the world, with the little difference is that he was not a right-wing or left-wing populist. He was a centrist populist or liberal populist, right? Paradoxically. But what he did, he removed the distance between the state and the society by his own example. Look at, for example, how it's indeed remarkable. Ukrainians liberated Izum, a town in the eastern Ukraine, and the next day Zelensky was there, surrounded by the soldiers. And this is a dramatic difference towards how Putin communicates, with this long table, not accepting people around him. So Zelensky shows, I'm one of you. Putin shows, I will not be one of you ever. I'm your Tsar, above you all. And the problem is that this doesn't really translate to all the institutions, because we still have lots of troubles with corruption. We still have cases of remarkable treachery and remarkable corruption, especially on the judiciary level. And this needs to requires a big work. But what civil society understood from this invasion, I think that, okay, we can have a vibrant civil society, active, creative people, but if we do not have state, it will collapse very, very quickly. We, Ukrainians, resist Russian invasion of course, because huge, remarkable mobilization of people. On the next day of the 24th, or on the same day of the 24th of February, you had territorial defense units in each village. You had block posts, checkpoints, people with rifles in every village. But if we did not have professional army, which, contrary to our political class, has well prepared, we would not stand.
Yeah. I have the questions which are very interesting for myself, so I just will ask you them, although maybe, I don't know about the audience, but I would like to know your position and your answer, or your how do you think about the debate about Russian literature? I have read various texts from Oksana Zabushko and the others who are very critical to that, saying, well, actually we shouldn't read, we should forbid them, we shouldn't read them. They are the roots of the evil. From Pushkin to Brodsky, who was actually whose poem about Ukrainians was terrible. What's your position here?
There are two levels of this. I wrote a text for foreign policy on that, which provokes a huge discussion. I think there are two levels of this. The first level is for Ukrainian society. For Ukrainian society, Russian literature was really a tool of colonization and a tool of erasing our own culture. So when a typical Ukrainian family would have Pushkin, Lermontov, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, but not have Lesya Ukrainka, Khvylyovy, people from the executive renaissance of the 20s, that shows that Russian literature was used as a tool of erasing the local literature, the local culture. In this sense, of course, we just need much more Ukrainian culture in schools. So our children should be educated on Ukrainian literature and world literature, including maybe some examples of Russian literature, but not right now. We have a situation like the course of the world literature of the early 20th century is like 5 authors and 4 of them Russian. I think this is wrong, right? The next thing, the next problem is that I think Ukrainians should read Russian literature very critically right now and do the same job as, for example, Edward Said has done for the Western literature. And you need people from kind of a colonized, oppressed cultures not to make a revenge on them, but just to have another critical ear. So when Said criticizes Flaubert or Kipling or Joseph Conrad for their colonialism, does this mean that we cancel these writers? Well, we introduce the debate around them. For me, like a person who loves French literature, I understand that Salammbô by Flaubert is a fantastic novel. I think the best novel of Flaubert, but it is horribly Orientalist and imperialist, right? And we can combine both perspectives. So we should do the same with Russian literature. Yeah. And the problem is that when the Western culture were looking at the Russian culture, they were accepting the Russian narratives about themselves, about itself. They were looking at the Russian culture as an alternative to the Western culture. And Russian culture was enjoying that very much. And I think we need another voice who would look at the Russian culture also from this imperialist point of view and see, for example, that when Lermontov writes about Caucasus, or when Pushkin writes about Caucasus or Ukraine, or when Bulgakov writes about Ukraine or Caucasus, these are very in parallel always. And therefore, attack on Georgia and attack on Ukraine was so, right now, two events of this new Russian imperialism. So they are having certain practices. And the key practice was to deny the future. So they were saying, like when Lermontov writes Mtsiri about Caucasus, he is showing a certain image of a local person who speaks, yes, not deprived of speech, but he speaks only with nostalgic voice. And you can understand that the leitmotif of that is, yes, I'm in an interesting culture, but the only thing I have is the past. And this is also a tool of domination. The same about Ukrainian culture. When Pushkin writes Poltava about Ivan Mazepa and about Ukrainian Cossacks, he presents Ukrainian Cossacks as cruel, bloody murderers. And this is something that is going on now, right now, because when Russian propaganda is presenting Ukrainians as cruel, bloody murderers / Nazis, and by this presenting, they're saying, okay, if they're cruel, bloody murderers, then we can do cruel, bloody murder against themselves. They are genociders, therefore we can do genocide against them. So I think this is something that we need just to reflect and open up a very critical discussion about that. I think that Ukrainian voice should be kind of a conscience of the Russian literature.
But I totally agree, and I think that's one of the partial, side effects of this. That it's a new view on Russian literature. I personally have to admit that I never before read Tolstoy or the others like the literature of empire. I just never realized that, and it's just fascinating to switch and to read it again with new eyes. Just once, but how do you think about? Bulgakov was born in Ukraine, I think, and even Gogol and Isaac Babel was from Odessa. How do you think about this, for example? Isaac Babel was a Jewish author, okay, but he was from Odessa. How is that?
Well, I think the Ukrainian literary canon should encompass many non-Ukrainian language writers. Jewish writers, people who were writing in Yiddish. We have a few Nobel Prize winners who are from Ukraine, like Agnon, for example, who is from Buchach, who wrote some novels in Yiddish, then in Hebrew. And it doesn't necessarily mean that he would be kind of very nice towards Ukraine. So Agnon has a very specific idea of, for example, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whom Ukrainians consider as a national hero, and whom Jewish tradition considers as a pogromist. So I think we need to look at these different perspectives and try to combine them and try to balance them. So Russian-speaking literature, some of the texts are very vital for Ukrainian canon. For me, for example, the text by Anatoly Kuznetsov about Babyn Yar, which was written in Russian, this novel, and which is a fantastic, well, maybe the best thing written about Babyn Yar, this one of the most important and horrible crimes of the Holocaust by bullets, which happened in 1941, when in 2 days in Kiev, Nazis killed several dozens of thousands of Jewish people, but not only Jewish people. So there are many things like that. With regard to Bulgakov, there are certain talented things in his novels, but we also should not be blind towards certain chauvinistic notes in his novels and just see it in this way. And again, the two primary things were Ukraine and the Caucasus. But I'm reading Bulgakov as a kind of a diagnost of his epoch. And there are two things that worries me. The first thing is how, well, worries or not worries. If you take Master and Margarita, then you understand one very important thing. The only force that wages justice in this novel is the devil. Voland is the only force that brings justice to this world. So it's not like Goethe's Mephistopheles. Goethe's Mephistopheles, as we all remember, wants evil but does the good. The Bulgakov's version of Mephistopheles, meaning Voland, does not good but justice. So but how he does justice? By punishing people. So it's all the novel about kind of a certain resentment which we could understand, but as if Bulgakov is saying that the only hope for justice or for punishment for crimes in this world is devil. And I find it very worrying, actually. I find it very worrying and I would say that we can read Master and Margarita as a hidden justification of Stalinism.
Well, I think I have to read again. I think that's maybe undermine for many Europeans. Bulgakov is just one of the best or the best, and especially this novel.
Well, it doesn't mean that I think Master and Margarita is a great novel, but I think we need to also preparate it critically and open the discussion about it.
Yeah, I understand that, because when I was thinking about the debate about that in recent months, I realized that I'm mostly educated, or I mostly read Western literature. I mean, English, American, whatever, German, French, and I remember as a young man, child, whatever, that all the novels I have read had a clear moral kind of clue and line. It was clear what was bad and what was wrong. Even the heroes, however they were sometimes bad, but that he was bad. In Russian literature, it's not like that.
And that's the problem, because you can consider it as a critical thinking, but critical thinking should have certain limits. If critical thinking goes too far, that becomes cynicism. Therefore, Sloterdijk was right when he wrote Critique of Zynischen Vernunft, the cynical reason. So the critical thinking should not undermine our understanding that there are facts and there are lies, and should not undermine our faith in values. And I think you're absolutely right in this diagnosis, is that what worries me in many things in Russian literature is that it just erases the distinction between the saint and the God and the devil, the saint and the killer, like Crime and Punishment.
Exactly.
We are facing with, and therefore I'm always quoting my wife Tanya Harkova, who just gave a very good diagnosis of this Russian invasion and of this Russian feeling of impunity and of Stalinism, crime without punishment and punishment without crime. And I think this starts with Dostoevsky, because in Crime and Punishment there is basically no punishment and no link which connects crime and punishment. And that means that the very idea of justice just is removed. And remember what Raskolnikov is saying, either I am a very inferior creature or I have the right. And that means that he has the right only by murder. So he opens up a way to kind of a good by murdering, by doing evil. That's something which is very disturbing for me. I think there are roots of this moral nihilism which are present in the current Russian political regime.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating, because I never heard about these arguments ever before, actually. The war opened something very crucial in the, actually, even the Western thinking in this. But talking about this intellectual, kind of luxury of this debate, that we can talk about this. I have read some month ago And I personally am deeply frustrated by the reaction of some leftist intellectuals in the West, especially Noam Chomsky, but even Varoufakis and the others, being reluctant to recognize that there is an aggressor and there is a victim, and then we should be by all force to be on the side of Ukraine, because Noam Chomsky, he admits that for a minute, and the next hour he talks about American as an evil. And I have read also wonderful letters from Ukraine left intellectuals about Chomsky. What is your, when you read, or if you read that, or if you know about that, and how do you see this leftist stupidity of this Western? I think it's very stupid, but it has some roots. But I would like to know, how do you see that?
I think it's a kind of a negative in the photographical sense of the word, negative of the imperialism itself, of Western imperialism, because in the 19th century the West was saying that the West is the only good. Now these leftist guys are saying that the West is the only evil. It's like nobody can remove us from this first place, from being the most remarkable evil on earth. How dare you to challenge that? And I think this is also kind of this negative imperialism, we can say, right? So this failure to admit that there are probably other imperialisms that can compete with Western imperialism and can even beat it in a certain level of cruelty, because, well, we can be very critical of Western imperialism, but Noam Chomsky is possible in the Western discourse, and nobody like Noam Chomsky is possible in the Russian discourse unless they leave Russia, right? Yeah. And there is huge debate about how bad was Iraqi war, and maybe there is, I don't know, the American society, but I have the increasing impression that this is a consensus, or not consensus, at least majority believes that this was a huge mistake. But I don't see much of the discussion in Russian society, not only about the Ukrainian invasion in Ukraine, but invasion into Afghanistan. What is also remarkable is that, Ukrainian society has also these imperialist traces. And for example, we still have not reflected Afghanistan, the Soviet war in Afghanistan.
In Ukraine, yeah.
In Ukraine. And one example I will give to you, that in my hometown, Brovary, until the 24th of February, there was a monument to Afghani, meaning Afghanci in our context means the Soviet soldiers who went to Afghanistan. There was an armored vehicle in the Central Park, was kind of commemorating their international duty. So that means that this reflection in the Ukrainian society even takes a very long time, and it will take even much more longer time in the Soviet Union, because Ukrainians were also part of this empire and partially responsible for these crimes as well.
Is it? I mean, actually, I don't know. Absolutely, I don't know about that. But I know how it is in Russia. Well, in 1968, the Soviet army occupied Czechoslovakia, which is still kind of a trauma here. And I know the Russians. Well, some of them, of course, some heroes and some intellectuals acknowledged that, and there was some, but mainly it wasn't an issue in Russian thinking at all. Is that any kind of trace of Ukrainian, thought about that we might have been responsible for that as well?
Yes, of course. This is considered. Budapest of 1956, Prague in 1968 as a big, and Poland in early ages. There was also almost an invasion. This was considered as as the big crimes of the Soviet Union. And I think the honest debate in Ukraine would say that, okay, but there were Ukrainians in this Red Army as well. And
Absolutely.
as there were Ukrainians in the Red Army that were doing crimes during the Second World War. I would not say this debate is present, maybe because we are overwhelmed with the current reality, but I'm sure that this should be done. If a nation thinks that it is only a victim or only a hero, that leads to horrible results, horrible consequences. So I think we should accept that in every nation there are good people and bad people. And good periods of history and bad periods of history.
Do you have friends in Russia? Are you in contact with them?
Unfortunately, no. The only Russian... Well, we had friends, certain friends, and their reaction who were anti-Putinist and who were liberal, but their reaction to this invasion disappointed us very much, and we cut the relations with them. I will tell you why, because the language that they were using was so shocking for us. They seemed so... Some of them, I will not tell the names, but some of them were distancing themselves from this and saying, okay, this is not a war of good and evil. This is kind of a lack of any moral judgment. And one phrase that struck me is a phrase that, okay, let's talk when the dust will come down. And we were in a situation when we were literally under missile attacks, and literally our friends died, and I think dust will come down. This is not a language. That means that this person just completely misunderstands what's happening.
You are editor-in-chief of this Ukraine World, what is it, kind of an open media space. It's kind of a various types of videos, reports, and so on. So I have seen some videos of you. You are walking around the cities which are bombarded, and there's a horrible scene of that. I mean, I myself, I have to admit that sometimes already I'm so tired, and it's not fair. Sometimes I can't read anymore. I mean, I do, but I can't read all of them, all these reports about the horrors, I mean, about the hundreds of bodies just now in Izium and whatever. But you do it. You go there, you see that, well, you are a philosopher. I mean, it's not time to wait when the dust is over, because, I mean, it's now. You have any tool how to think about that?
Well, how to think? What I'm trying to do is two things. The first is to learn human stories and to tell them to the world, tell these human stories to the world. We are doing a lot of human stories on our Ukraine World. We have a chapter on our site which is called Stories, and we just tell the stories. I think it's very important because there is no general experience of the war. Each experience is unique, and in some way it is not transferable. So when, for example, in Bucha recently we were on this car cemetery. This is a collection of burnt cars who were burnt when civilians were trying to escape, and the Russians were just shelling civilian cars. And we had a man who approached to us, a big, robust man, and he was almost crying, and he said, I recognize this car. This is car of my neighbor and friend. And look inside the windows, and you will see even the remnants of his bone. And we looked inside, and we really see one little bone. All the rest has burnt out, and this was just a white bone of ash, something like this. And then he said that the woman, his wife, survived, and two of his daughters, and the younger daughter lost her hand. It was amputated. And I think we need just to learn these stories and to tell them. And for example, this family has their houses intact, most probably, but they lost a beloved husband and this girl without a hand. And I don't think they will ever come back to this place. Another family would say to us that hopefully they are alive, but they had several houses on the same territory, like mother house, they and their house. And you should understand, maybe in Slovakia it's also the case. People are building their houses themselves with their own hands.
Exactly, it's like here.
Throughout like decades. And imagine you were building your house in 20 years, sometimes this is the case, and it's just destroyed in 20 seconds. So I think we need to tell the stories as much as possible because this is, we should not perceive the war as only the map or the figures or the advances or the strategy or whatever, or even the reports about victories. Victory is always important, but it is always very tragic, and I think this is something we try to tell to the world, and then not only us. There are so many people working on that.
Thank you very much. I mean, the time is up, and well, I would talk to hours and hours if it's up to me. But there are some rules here. So thank you very much that you came here, because I mean, this is a small time in a small country, but. Especially, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for invitation. I'm very glad to be here. Really, I love Central Europe.